Welcome back to the training suite of the Joint Intersectoral Analysis Framework, or short, the JIAF. The training suite consists of three elements: 4 high-level pre-recorded presentations of about 20 minutes, 8 more in-depth blended sessions of about 30 to 40 minutes, including exercises, and additional technical workshops and webinars. The 4 high-level sessions provide a broad overview of the JIAF and an introduction to its concept, methodology, and process. The 8 in-depth blended sessions dive into more detail of the framework, the indicators and severity, aggregation and PIN. They look at the process in more detail in terms of coordination setup and look at the process step by step. They look at best practices from the JIAF 1.1 and provides an overview to intercluster coordinators, HPC focal points, and country cluster coordinators. This is presentation 6 of the 8 blended learning sessions. This session focuses on emerging good practice. The objective of this session is to showcase good examples of how the JIAF has been applied. The session will highlight good emerging practice in HNOs. In particular, we'll be looking at section 1.4 of the HNO, the chapter on humanitarian conditions and severity of needs. And we'll also be looking at linking the pillars of the conceptual framework in order to tell the story. Let's start by looking at some recent examples of section 1.4 from last year's HNOs. As a reminder, let's look at how the JIAF and the HNO link. The HNO is where we present our findings from the JIAF process. The HNO illustrates the evidence base we developed using the JIAF that will then underpin the collective humanitarian response. The HNO structure is linear in its presentation and follows mostly the JIAF conceptual framework. The first 3 pillars of the JIAF, context, shock, and impact, correspond to the sections 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3 in the HNO. The 2 key functions of the analysis of these first 3 pillars, context, shock, and impact, are to set in the JIAF and define in the HNO the scope of analysis. The other main function is to enrich the analysis and influence the final conclusions of the HNO in terms of severity, PIN, and projections. The scope of analysis in the HNO, section 1.3, is where we present what people, areas, and themes the HNO will focus on. In a way, it is the conclusion of the first 3 pillars of the JIAF and gives the evidentiary reasoning on what to focus on for the rest of the HNO. Pillar 4 in the JIAF and section 1.4 in the HNO form the analytical heart. This is where all the analysis comes together, linking back to context, shock, and impact, and exploring how humanitarian conditions manifest themselves in the most vulnerable groups. To allow for a truly people-centered lens, this section should be organized by vulnerable groups. So let's go and have a look at some concrete examples. For the English-speaking colleagues, we recommend to have a look at the Libya and Iraq HNO. Pour les collègues francophones, veuillez regarder les exemples du Haïti et du Niger. The links to the HNO examples are embedded in this slide and are available in the resource folder. Now for the exercise, take 20 or 30 minutes, go directly to section 1.4 and then look at how the section is structured, how the JIAF is applied, note any strong points, and maybe elements you think could be further improved. When finished, you can unpause the presentation and continue. I hope you took the time to look at one, maybe two concrete examples. Now some general observations on section 1.4. Generally considered as good emerging practice is when section 1.4 is organized by a group, allowing for a people-centered analysis. It looks at how the humanitarian conditions interact, and it tries to understand severity within the groups. It makes good use of assessment data and looks at how needs have evolved over time. However, there are, in all of the examples, also elements to improve. One aspect is linking the analysis back to the context, shock and impact analysis, and linking this with the humanitarian conditions and severity. Another aspect is the identification of common problems between groups and unpacking why problems manifest differently within groups. Those are all elements that generally can be improved looking at most of last year's HNOs. Now, let's look at the other aspect we would like to cover in this session. It's about telling the story, how to link the pillars of the JIAF. This is generally an element where almost all HNOs we see scope for improvement. But there is some good emerging practice that we'll look at in a short moment. So, what's the point of the first three pillars and why is it important to link them? As mentioned a few slides earlier, the context, shock and impact pillar help to frame and enrich the analysis and influence the decisions about the final conclusions of the HNOs in terms of severity, pin and projection. In a way, it ties together your HNO and helps to build the narrative. It helps to provide answers on why needs are occurring in a way that they are, taking into consideration contextual factors, differential risks, exposure to various shocks, etc. It also helps, along with the experts, to serve as a final check on the calculations done in the aggregation process. To make this concrete, we recommend that you pause again the presentation and take the time to look at the Yemen and Nigeria examples. The links are embedded in this slide and available in the resource folder. Now, when looking at those HNOs, look at how the sections are linked, how section 1.4 refers back to the contextual analysis, note any strong points and elements to improve. When you've done so, unpause the presentation and continue. So, the Nigeria HNO does a good job at summarizing the contextual factors and explaining how they influence humanitarian conditions. Also, drivers and causality of needs are summarized for each group. The HNO also acknowledges the need for more analysis of social fabric, social networks, and social capital in influencing IDP ability to cope. Basically acknowledging that a more detailed analysis of context, shock and impact could be done at community level. The HNO does also a good job at telling the story. It features, for example, sociocultural profiles in the contextual analysis that identify a particularly marginalized group. As the HNO analysis progresses through the sections covering shocks and impact of the crisis, it consistently refers back to those and demonstrates their distinct effects on this particularly vulnerable group. In the section covering humanitarian conditions and severity, this group was then highlighted as having specific needs, with their causal and associated factors clearly identified. In conclusion, some general observations on this. If the analysis of the context, shock and impact does not demonstrate a direct influence on the nature of humanitarian conditions, don't bother writing it up in the HNO. In that sense, less is more. And for what is left, make sure that the story is told. In the HNO, each section should refer back to the pillars of the conceptual framework. Consider profiling the main affected groups and take the reader through their experience. All this together should allow to develop a compelling narrative and telling the story. Finally, some tips for your consideration on how to ensure that context, the analysis of context, is used meaningfully. First, collect context, shock and impact information at the same unit of analysis. You may consider using a structured approach with the help of DEEP, a secondary data analysis tool. You can Google it, you'll find a lot of information on this. Secondly, collate and treat context, shock and impact information as indicators where possible. This could be livelihood zones and poverty levels, conflict intensity by areas, IDP numbers by area, etc. Finally, view and analyze those indicators alongside your humanitarian conditions indicators and aggregations. You can look for patterns to help explain causality and associated factors. And in the last step, you wish to consider to consult the context, shock and impact info in the final step of validation when revising the PIN and severity. With this, we're coming to the end of this presentation 6 on good practices. We looked at examples in section 1.4 of last year's HNOs, and we looked at examples of how the story can be told in a more compelling manner by linking the pillars of the conceptual framework. For more information and resources, please visit JIAF.info or our knowledge management platform. The link is featured here below on the slide. Many thanks for your attention.